Maybe there's something about suffering and being in a subjugated space that de facto places us on a higher plane. If I personalize it, I think I know, I have firsthand knowledge of what it feels like to be stepped on, stepped over, dismissed, and visibilized. I have firsthand knowledge of that in a very visceral way. And maybe there's something that comes out of that experience that solidifies the soul, that provides a vision of the world that one cannot get when you're the crusher, when you're the one who's oppressing. And so while I may have some rage about that experience, I'm also in a position where I'm so acutely aware of what it feels like that I don't want anyone else to have that experience. And maybe there's something about that that's the high road, if there's such a thing.
Welcome to Therapist Uncensored. Building on decades of professional experience, this podcast tackles neurobiology, modern attachment, and more in an honest way that's helpful in healing humans. Your session begins now with Dr. Ann Kelley and Sue Marriott.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Therapist Uncensored. Our guest today is someone that is very near and dear to Sue and I's heart because we've been studying and thinking and learning from and growing from this man a great deal, and that he's agreed to be on the podcast is such an honor. So today we are speaking with Dr. Kenneth Hardy. He is the president of Eichenberg Academy for Social Justice and clinical and organizational consultant for the Eichenberg Institute for Relationships in New York City. Welcome, Dr. Hardy. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. It's a wonderful opportunity to spend this time with you.
Well, I got to meet you in person at Psychotherapy Network this year and attended one of your workshops that has really stuck with me. And when I approached you to come on, and your willingness to do this was really touching, because I think I was moved, not just because I would love to have you here. What you were speaking about felt so true to Sue and I's heart about helping us navigate this really difficult space in the world around race, around culture, and doing it in a way that we move the conversations forward. And I felt that conversation, not just from hearing from you, but the dialogue that we had in the audience was really impactful. I was going to say touching, but it was impactful for me. And I was hoping that we can just drop into some of that here.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit? I just gave you the kind of the top bio, but you've also written very informative books. Could you tell us just a little bit about yourself and how you would describe yourself?
I'm trained as a clinician, and yet I see, and I've always seen my work being much broader than the consulting room. And I think so much of it had to do with just my own personal experiences, and some of those dating back to graduate school, but even prior to graduate school. I mean, just in terms of growing up in the world, and this is not unique to me, but just getting to see real up close and in intimate ways just the inequities in our society, and how that our rhetoric and ideals that we subscribe to don't always hold true for the practices of everyday life. And so I just became early on intrigued with what I consider to be a chasm between our ideals and the things that we say that make us feel good about ourselves, and then the things that we deal with in everyday pragmatics of life. And so that has kind of given direction to my work. And I've written about this in various blotches, different places, but I'm the firstborn son of two parents who grew up in the South, and at a time, one of the ugliest periods in our country's history. And so the indignities that they were repetitively exposed to became life credentials for them, and also scarred them. And I'm sure in ways that they probably weren't even aware of, informed how they parented and how they negotiated all parts of their lives. And so I grew up, well, in addition to my parents, my grandmother lived with us until I was like a sophomore in college. And she was the granddaughter of a slave. And so I spent just you know, extraordinary amounts of time listening to her talk about humans and humanity to humans, and who was very open and willing to talk about race because it had been such a profound organizing principle in her life and my parents' lives. And so I grew up hearing conversations, and I think, shaped and molded me in ways that I wasn't even aware was happening at the time. So that has somehow been threaded throughout my work. I mean, I didn't, the way these things work, didn't seek out my training anticipating spending the amount of time that I've spent thinking and writing about race and by extension other inequities in life. But once I began to get a deeper understanding of race, then saw the ways in which it was inextricably tied to other manifestations of inequities and injustice. And so it became hard to think about one without thinking about the others. And so that's where I am now. And so I often say that if someone had told me back in middle school that you'd be a therapist and spend time in academia, all the things I've done are things I never imagined myself doing. And I'll just say here, just this one final piece to add to this, that I was very intentional about the Institute, that Eichenberg actually is my mother's maiden name. And you get pushback from colleagues, mostly black colleagues, about why I would give the Institute such what they felt like was a European, Eastern European, German, Jewish sounding name. And I understood where they were coming from. They was because that white folks would never name their institutes after something that sounded or was affiliated with blackness. And yet I kept saying, rather repetitively, it's my mother's maiden name, which was most significant for me. And so I just thought that it was just a way to honor her and the legacy. And I fully understand that the name has a very complicated history attached to it. But I want to keep that in front of me and viscerally connected to it. So, and it's funny because I've had colleagues, really close colleagues, who had like an unrelenting curiosity about the name, but would never ask me. They'd ask like friends, does Ken have some rich Jewish donor? Or, like, why Eichenberg? And so even that was not easy for people to talk about. So I just started naming it up front. So
I've heard you speak about that, and I'm really glad that you just named it because I think that's part of what I'm gaining, what we continuously gain from your work, and that is to not shy away from the controversy and not to change the name because of the experience of what a white person might think or what a black, like you named it based on what was true to your own experience. And then you're inviting in complicated feelings about it rather than shifting it. And it feels like your work is about us taking on the complicated feelings that we do have and having conversations around it.
yeah, I think that's an important centerpiece. And at the same time, I said I recognize it's also difficult to do because, we're not often encouraged to do that.
Mhm. There's so much that you've already covered that I am spinning with, and the recent writings that you've done based on this experience, speaking about race from a very young age, right? That is, so many of us did not grow up, even especially in our white bodies, talking about race on any level. And if we heard the word race, we thought about it as something to do with somebody else, a person of color. Like even Sue and I often talk about like not even conceptualizing race for many, many years. So the work, the how much that I feel like I've personally gained through your work and labor, I feel so much gratitude for. You've talked about in some of the writings that you've done on becoming a racially sensitive therapist, and especially your book also on racial trauma, clinical strategies and techniques for healing invisible wounds, and the highlighting of these things that because race isn't spoken about and we're not taught how to have these difficult conversations or even recognize how we've been impacted and how people of color have been impacted. And I'm wondering if you could take just a couple of minutes. I know we can't cover everything I'd love to cover in 45 minutes. But can you talk just a little bit about the invisible wounds? Many people have already heard about it that have been on this podcast, but or that have been listening to the podcast. But would you mind just briefly talking about that?
No, it really, I appreciate you affording me the opportunity to do so, because I just feel like the more I and we talk about them, the less invisible they become. And I think that's what was striking to me about the notion. And I'll give a truncated version of this, but part of what started me thinking about invisible wounds was that what emanated from a car accident I was involved in, and became rather quickly aware of how folks around me responded to my visible wounds in contrast to ones that were not visible. And so there was a way in which the typical response was, oh, you're trying to position yourself for a big insurance payoff, or you're malingering. Because I think we live in a society that places a stronger value over the physical rather than metaphysical, what we can see rather than what we can't see. And so that's why I started thinking about this notion of invisible wounds. And then I realized that for folks of color, that we are, I believe the day we're born into a society where we are subject to attacks and pricks and metaphorical stabbings and punctures, and that it occurs below the radar. Nobody sees it, and it's never named. And I think that one of the things that COVID taught us was that naming is a very powerful thing. And so prior to, in that late 2019, early 2020, when this virus was attacking so many of us, because we didn't have a name for it initially, it was very difficult to talk about. Because it was difficult to talk about, it was very difficult to acknowledge. Because it was difficult to acknowledge, it's difficult to treat. And I think that that's the impact that racial oppression has had on people of color, that we all walk around, no matter what our lot in life, with a plethora of these invisible wounds for which there's no name. And because there's no name, there's no acknowledgement. And because there's no acknowledgement, there's no treatment. So there's no mentioning of anything that would come remotely close to an invisible wound in a DSM, for example. And so that people of color are left with the burden of suffering, enduring the pain of these wounds. And they're not just invisible to the onlooker, they're invisible to the purveyors of those wounds. And so we're left with the only hypothesis that makes sense, which is, I must be crazy, or this is in my head. And then, of course, the broader society reinforces those notions. And so when I hear people of color, particularly Black people, talk about being tired and fatigue, I know intuitively that they're not talking about anything that is uniquely physical, but it's the closest they can come to of describing this affective sensation that they're grappling with, for which there's no name. And so I think that the carriers of the wound are not aware of them, and then those of us who provide treatment are not aware of them. And so for the most part, they just exist, and we're left to sort of grapple with the consequences of all of that.
And feeling responsible for how they manifest in the body.
And just one other thing I'll say, which, I in the book identify these 7 wounds, and one of those is rage, that I really want to punctuate here, because I think it's an ultimate act of cruelty for society to treat folks of color in a way, to set up conditions that are, for the most part, inhumane, that cannot not engender anger and rage, and then on top of it, to punish and pathologize people for having the wound of rage, so that to even express it. And so what you have is countless number of people of color, and particularly Black people, walking around eager to convince colleagues, their therapists, onlookers, oh, I'm not angry. I'm not. because it's been so weaponized and so pathologized that this thing, which is a natural reaction to a set of unnatural circumstances, we can't even claim which would be the first step toward treating it, in my estimation. Like, that always strikes me as being the epitome of what it means to have your soul punctured, if not slaughtered.
And the reference of the soul rage and the characterization of the angry Black person being so weaponized rather than the rage being identified is so appropriate and healthy in a way. Like, think about it when we talk about sexual assault, the perpetrator and the victim feeling the blame to themselves instead of being able to live in the rage. That is a healing process to identify and be able to live in and say, this makes sense.
Yes, and in the clinical context, it makes it hard for therapists to be helpful in that regard because so many of us, and particularly, we all sort of, in one sense, metaphorically breathe the same air, swim in the same water. And so it's not uncommon for therapists to then associate rage and anger and blackness and fearfulness. So to actually create the space to even lean in to potentially pursue these issues in therapy, by and large, doesn't happen because if you're sitting here with me and you have a healthy fear of these internalized racial messages you have about how dangerous I am, then you approach me very cautiously in the context of us sitting in a setting that's designed to ostensibly help me. And so that's, like, quite fascinating to me too, and the ways in which that, and I make this point in a couple of books I've written, that there is no appropriate place, designated place in our society to deal with rage. Therapy ideally should be a place, but we can't do this as therapists if we are also fearful and we've bought into this notion that your affect and your presence and the color of your skin deems you a danger to me.
And if we're all in the same soup and we don't recognize that we're in the same soup and we think of ourselves as separate, we can't be in the healing journey together. For the white therapist out there listening, you're talking about being a racially sensitive therapist. And it's not just an intellectual awareness, right? It's taking it into the body, our own fears, the fragility that we hold of being looked at. Or what do you feel like would be, I know, the most important thing for the white therapist out there to take in, to hear? What do we not know that we need to know?
I think two things, and they're related. I do think, and that workshop you attended, I tried to elaborate on these there. One is developing a racial lens, because I don't think that, for the most part, white people are socialized to have one. And yet, so I've been looking at the world through this lens, this prism, all my life, and would find it dangerous not to. And so I think to develop a racial lens, which means how do you look at what you've always looked at as a white person and begin to see it through a lens of race, that starts with the second thing is developing a racial sense of self, so that you're not just Irish or Italian, your ethnicity, you're not just your gender, your sexual orientation, you're not just middle age, but you're all those things, and you're also white. And to be able to engage in a process of self-examination, self-interrogation, and self-reflection about one's whiteness, I think is absolutely essential for the white clinician. Because I think that we all have two dimensions of ourselves. We have a preferred racial view of ourselves, and we have a dreaded one. And I think that most white clinicians, many white clinicians, particularly those who are progressive, have a fairly good sense about their preferred racial view. but I don't know how many actually come to terms with unpacking, interrogating the dreaded racial view, the part of me that is the progeny of parents who held a pro-racist ideology, or the fact that I grew up in a family where I've heard references to Latinos or blacks that I dare not repeat today, but those things still live in my body. What has happened to them? Where did they go? And so rather than the natural knee-jerk reaction is to disavow from those things, I think we have to create a healthy love relationship with those parts of ourselves and begin a process of critical inquiry. I think that's important.
That's such a wonderful way to put it because I can relate to all of those versions of wanting to separate myself as the other, as different from, and I think about also the process of, I see a lot of today of othering and also like the call out culture. We spoke about the call out culture. And somehow, if I could call out other people's racism, if I could call out other evidence of this, then I'm somehow separate from that. And getting in touch with that part of my own privilege that I live in, that I don't walk outside my door and think of myself as a white person, as a person of color, a black person walks out thinking of themselves. They can't not think of that. How that affects the way I see the world and how I see a client that is in my office, whether that person is white or black. And so getting in touch with that is painful. It's hard. It's not one to sign me up. I want to really see how my family, I was in a conference one day, somebody stood up and I was raised in a non-racist, racist family. And I so related to that comment, just like to really reckon with what part of racism I hold and was raised in and seeped in, and that it's still in my soup. I might have separated from it. Hopefully, I've advanced from my parents and their grandparents, but I still have the shame involved of that kind of way I was raised. And I still have the biases involved in my everyday experience. And coming to terms with that is hard and it's painful.
It really, and that's why, like this journey around becoming a racially sensitive therapist, I was careful in the book to really talk about this notion of becoming, because I don't think it's simply a matter of acquiring skills and mastery of skills. I think those things are important. But I think ultimately the essence of the work is about grappling with being amenable to being swept into a process that really is organized around self interrogation, self inquiry, self reflection. Because I always think that the work, whether it's for individuals or institutions, is work that starts inside out.
The conference that I attended, you spoke about, the inside out, understanding our own sides of our own privilege, and that every one of us, no matter person of color or not, stands in some level of privilege and some level of subjugated self. And that was a very powerful discussion. Could you unpack that a little bit for us, or kind of?
Yeah, so I think that part of this work and part of that, the self work, is about making the necessary transformation in terms of how we think about ourselves and by extension think about others. And so I'm always trying to discourage both myself and others from thinking about myself as a singular entity, but rather to think about my selves, that I have a number of selves. And all of those selves are attached in some way to either experiences of privilege or subjugation. And when we develop a kind of impeccable clarity of that, then we're much better able to see situations situationally and see ourselves contextually, than rather thinking I have one unified integrated self and that's what I operate from. And so I think that it's important for me to understand that despite my racial subjugation, that I live in a world where I am valued as male, as heterosexual, as cisgender, as middle class, as educated. All of those are uniquely privileged positions, and it makes sense that would get bogged down and mired into my subjugation, because I think we all default to that position. And yet I think it is one of the single most things that contributes to impasse and our inability to have relationships with each other. I think it's why in conversations about race, white women default to being women and not white. And I think that's problematic. And when you critique that, it's almost as if what's being said is your gender is irrelevant, which is not the message, but rather in this particular context, this is a conversation that's begging for your privileged white self to participate and not your subjugated gender self or ethnic self or any other places where one might hold. And so I think when we can appreciate that kind of complexity about our own being, then we're able to extend that in interactions, which I think do, that allows us to stay in these conversations longer because they become less explosive.
Rather than allowing ourselves to land in the activation of the subjugated self, right? And you talked a little bit about that, where if we're feeling the activation, we're going to push ourselves out in a way that loses touch with the ability to stay connected in the conversation.
Or to even humanize the other person, to stay in a relationship, it becomes all out war because I think that's what's activated that moment is deeply, air quotes, primitive in a sense, that and that there's some piece, like there's like with any kind of trauma-based response like that, that there is an imminent threat that's attached to that's hard to process in the moment. And so I'm responding from that place, although my reactions may not expose the level of vulnerability that I'm feeling. And to me, that's what's so complicated about these exchanges, that they can escalate so quickly, where we draw the line and declare war, and it doesn't allow us to move the needle at all.
Hey everyone, I have some great news to share. Our partner, AG1, just launched their next generation. So, in the same single scoop, you now get more vitamins, minerals, and upgraded probiotics. And it's now backed by 4 human clinical trials. So, in fact, AG1's next generation is now one of the most clinically backed greens powder. They went above and beyond the industry standard in testing and have made a great product actually even better. We frequently speak on the podcast about how important gut health is to our moods, our overall energy. And it's so hard to know what to do about it. I hate taking pills, and finding the right regimen doesn't always sometimes seem like just daunting. But AG1 Next Generation is clinically shown to fill common nutrient gaps, even in healthy eaters, actually, and support gut health. So this helps me know that I'm doing something good for my health. I actually look forward to my afternoon drink. I still love the taste. It's a refreshing way to get my foundational nutritional supplements. So, subscribe today to try the next generation of AG1. If you use our link, you'll also get a free bottle of AG D3K2 and AG1 welcome kit, as well as 5 upgraded travel packs with your first order. So make sure to check out drinkag1.com/therapist uncensored to get started with AG1's next generation. And notice the benefits for yourself. That's drinkag1.com/therapist uncensored. Hey everyone, I'm super jazzed to tell you about our new sponsor, Superpower. True story, I just finished a physical like a month or so before Superpower reached out to us. And with the physical, I got a blood test, and I was so disappointed. I found out such little information about the blood test. My iron's low, cholesterol really good. That's about it. Don't get me wrong, I feel very privileged to even be getting a physical, but like many of you, I want to know more. Superpower is a completely different experience. It's a new kind of preventative healthcare that's extremely comprehensive and personal. As a member, you do a baseline lab test, and with that, you get insight into over 100 biomarkers covering everything from heart, liver, and thyroid function to hormones, your metabolism, even how you're doing on vitamins and minerals. So it scans for thousands of healthcare markers and different diseases. You can find out why You might be too fatigued, your brain's foggy. Then after you get the results, you get a personalized action plan and access throughout the year to your own dedicated medical team to guide you. And then at 6 months, at no additional cost, you get another test to track how you're doing. My first round of testing, which I've completed, just blew me away. I got really specific test reminders about what foods to avoid to give my blood test, the most accurate, when to start fasting, even the morning of, a GPS link straight to where I was supposed to go for my test. No other unnecessary text since then. When I did the company review, we looked into the price of $4.99, which is what its regular price is. I thought was really good. People pay thousands of dollars for this. But then once we signed up, we found out that they're doing a special and you can get all of this for the current price of $199, which is pretty amazing. So Superpower is making proactive healthcare a reality and more accessible to so many people. So go to superpower.com to learn more, get the current price special of $199 while it lasts. And then after you sign up, they'll ask you how you learned about them. Please make sure to mention Therapist Uncensored to help support the show. You can be in this all together. Superpower.com. You brought an example to the presentation that you were doing at another university where a white woman in the audience talked about, how dare you talk about my privilege? And I think that's not an uncommon response.
It's not
at all. Right?
Trust me, it's not.
I've used it with my own children. You think,
right.
And I've heard it, don't call me privileged. How could you call me privileged? I came from this and this and this. And that happened. Would you mind sharing that story?
No, not at all. I mean, and to your point, it's a rather common occurrence. And so I was actually giving a lecture, talking about privilege and its particular point about the importance of white people recognizing that when you're born white, you're privileged, and that you have a piece of privilege connected to your race. And then I made this bold, somewhat provocative statement that it doesn't matter where whiteness manifests itself in our society. It is always privilege. It's a privileged position wherever it manifests itself. And so there was a student who had grown up poor and had been deeply devalued by that, which I think happens for us in our class of society. And so when she had gotten to the point where she had heard as much as she could stand to hear from me, so she raised her hand and she just unloaded on me and yelling at me, but I could also, lots of fury, but she's also crying. And so there was pain there. And she's yelling at me, how dare you, say I'm privileged. You don't know a damn thing about me. That's your arrogance that you would do this. I've never felt so disrespected. You don't know how many times I wanted to leave this workshop, but I couldn't leave without letting you know how arrogant and racist I find you. It was her point. And you could hear a feather drop in the room because, her words were piercing and poignant, and her affect was actually compelling. And so that moment there, it was helpful to me, if I could sort of give myself credit for this, that I understood that comment was coming from her place of subjugation. She talked about how her parents had to have 4 jobs in order for them to be able to even make ends meet. And so I thought it was so important there. And yet she's yelling at me, and she's clearly sort of, in a way, what I experienced, talking down to me. And that's not unfamiliar to me, of having white people talk down to me. And so it was clearly a plausible hypothesis that her comment is informed by race because, she's, lecturing me and so forth. And I could see other students in the forum getting, and particularly students of color, who were getting activated by, because they clearly are perceiving it racially. And so what I try to do is respond to her by thanking her for just letting me know in such a real and authentic way what it was like to sit through much of this meeting and hear these things that were personally jarring to her. And that I noticed that she mentioned that she wanted to leave several times. I applauded her for the level of tenacity that she was able to amass to stay. And And she said some things that were really important for me to hear and for all of us to hear. And was able to say to her that those experiences that you describe, there's a piece of me that relates to that, because what you're talking about is the way in which you've been and your family been devalued by having membership in this group that our society designates as poor, and therefore you're worthless and without value and should be ignored and stepped on and stepped over. And that made a lot of sense to me. And that she was also white, and that what she was responding, that she was talking about the lack of privilege they experience in terms of their class designation. But what I was talking about was the privilege that she enjoyed as a white person. And that I can see where she can be privileged as a white person and clearly subjugated as a poor person. Because white poor people certainly make out better in our society than poor people of color. And that's true for anything where you factor in race. And so I would hope that she would be able to take that feeling, the passion that she has from her experience of subjugation, and the kind of angst that she holds toward those who fingerprints her over her condition, that she's able to understand that, which is a hard message to receive, that there's a part of those folks who live in her that lives in all of us in some ways. And so I was able to get her to see that the presence of her subjugation does not eradicate her privilege. And I have the same conversation, which I probably mentioned at the workshop, with lots of men of color who think that somehow the racial subjugation really sort of sterilizes them in terms of any kind of male privilege that they might have, which I think both can be true and both actually often coexist. So I think that this is the kind of internal work that's needed and necessary for us to be able to show up in these cross-racial exchanges, but also in these sort of homogeneous racial exchanges as well. And I think they can be instrumental in keeping us out of the airspace of being reactive and interpersonally violent toward each other, which is where we tend to go, which is a kind of survivalist kind of response. And so she was able to sort of hold the complexity of that positionality in the group, but it wasn't easy for her, and it's never easy, quite frankly.
And it wasn't easy for you.
It wasn't easy for me as well, because you're absolutely right, because I'm having to hold back this part of me that's saying, this has nothing to do with class. This has to do with her not respecting you as a black person. And there may or may not been pieces of that were true, but in the moment, what I was clear about was that as the workshop facilitator, presenter, that I had to respond to her from that privileged position. And when that happens well, there are often openings to come back and talk about those other dimensions, but that is totally dependent on how that exchange. There are situations where I will do that. There's some situations where I don't do it, because I feel like, well, that this work is still taking place here, and I don't want to complicate that work by adding this other dimension. So let's just stay focused on this particular piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I remember some of the feedback, which I understood that you received after you told that story, came from a few persons of color who were like, okay, but you're asking us to take the high road. Like, we always, through their own subjugated self, have been required to take the high road for survival, right? Take the high road of air quotes, but having to live in the subjugated self just for the survival. And they felt that moment as still being asked to be called on. I guess at that point you were presenting the VCR model, which I would like to tap into. I mean, which we already are, but you've named it, I think, in a very helpful way. But you had several people go, but you're asking us to take the high road. And here this person's acting on their activation, right? She was not holding your blackness on any level. She was holding herself as priority, her subjugated self as priority in the room. And you were able to stay there. And like you said, you can't always do that, but you received some of that feedback. And I imagine when you said that these conversations happen, among people of color as well. What was that like? And I felt like you handled it really beautifully. But it was interesting. It was hard.
Yeah, I totally understand. And I think that to the point of your podcast, like, I think that those are the kinds of topics that we have to be able to talk about, because I understand what they were saying. And my response is a couple of things. One is, you're only being asked to take the high road if that assault came to your subjugated self from while you're in a subjugated position. But I'm asking you to take the high road while you're in a privileged position, which is the exact same thing that we want those who hurt and harm us to do, is to take responsibility for their privilege. So at that point, this participant's comments were to me as a presenter and required me to address that as a presenter. And so I have to be clear that the part of me that's speaking at that moment is executing the task of the privilege at that point. And that doesn't foreclose or limit the possibility that there's still another conversation that can be had where I give voice to my subjugated self. But the challenge for those of us who've had experiences, profound experiences with subjugation, is that we always, myself included, default to our subjugated positions, even times when it's inappropriate to do so. And so I'm hoping that we can develop the kind of clarity that we can make those in-game decisions about, okay, my subjugated self is activated, but my privileged self has a responsibility here. I always say this, it sounds somewhat flippant, but I think there's a little piece of me that believes this. And maybe there's something about suffering and being in a subjugated space that de facto places us on a higher plane. If I personalize it, like, I think I know, I have firsthand knowledge of what it feels like to be stepped on, stepped over, dismissed, and visibilized. I have firsthand knowledge of that in a very visceral way. And maybe there's something that comes out of that experience that solidifies the soul, that provides a vision of the world that one cannot get when you're the crusher, when you're the one who's oppressing. And so while I may have some rage about that experience, I'm also in a position where I'm so acutely aware of what it feels like that I don't want anyone else to have that experience. And maybe there's something about that that's the high road, if there's such a thing. Because I always operate from this point as a therapist in therapy, but even in my other roles as well, that if we truly want to grasp in a real firm way the depths of our greatness, it requires us to also be in touch with our suffering. Like, I think those two things are inextricably tied together. And so if I've had suffering that I've not embraced and not cultivated a relationship with, I always say that's the difference between being a jailer and being a healer. So in those moments where I'm being asked to do this thing that I think is taking the high road, which I think is all about you, is really ultimately about me.
That is an amazingly important point, because it feels like connecting, like if we let go, if this woman or if I was to let go of my suffering that I've experienced in the socioeconomic place, the being looked negatively upon or really being squashed from that regard, there's something about connecting to somebody else's subjugated part that can make me feel like I have to give up that part of self. Like there's somehow in relationship, it's either me or you, right? And our most activated self, Sue and I talk a lot about that in sort of attachment activation, connected to all of this, like that we move into a black and white, right? It's either me or you. Is your suffering more than her suffering, more than, and it feels like what you're saying is when we own our suffering and we feel the pain and we connect to it, that it's not necessarily a high or low road, I think is what I'm hearing you say. it's a connected road to self, and we can't always get there, and the pain involved of getting in touch with our own suffering allows us room and space and desire to get in touch with the other suffering. There's no more comparison. And it's so painful right now to feel like things are put in such a comparison role. Who has suffered most? Who is letting who down? And so I felt that a very powerful part of the whole room discussion. I mean, that's one thing that I think I apologize to the audience for talking about an event that they were not at. I know that's always hard, but I think everybody can imagine the conversations that were emerging from the different elements of the audience of what I felt the movement is that people were getting in touch with their own capacity to deal with those complex feelings, right? Which is really the core. I know we're running out of time, but I did want you to just to, if you wouldn't mind, that you brought in a VCR approach, a model for having and engaging conversations about race and other dimensions of culture and other parts of self, right? Like when you brought up the sense of self as a professor, you're saying all these different selves. I think of myself as a white person, as a woman, as a gay woman, like that. You're asking us to get in touch with all these different parts of herself, not just one part of self, but having engaging conversations. Could you talk a little bit about the VCR approach, which you've already have, but kind of naming it as a model in here, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, and so part of the VCR is about like I'm always asking students, clients, workshop participants to think about during those critical moments of exchanges to ask oneself. I probably said this at this workshop, to take a moment to think about what's important to me at this moment, to be right or to be in relationship. And so I happen to believe in that relationships have very powerful healing and transformative potential. And yet I don't think we invest in them long enough, because what happens when there are wrinkles or ruptures, then we retreat. So the VCR I developed as a mechanism that would allow us to stay in relationships even when it's tumultuous. And that it's predicated on the notion that the VCR is both a worldview, a kind of philosophy to live by, as well as a technique. And the technique cannot be effective if one doesn't subscribe to the ideology. And so the ideology is that I believe in the centrality of relationships, that there's one, the importance of embracing both and, so there's good that's contained in bad, bad that's contained in good. And that when we interact with folks, and particularly the more contentious the interaction, but I just hope it's like, for me, it's become like an everyday practice, period, is that I'm listening to the other person, and rather than preparing a defense or a challenge, that I'm really trying to, I'm engaged in a kind of deep listening where my goal is to understand what you're saying and to see you complexly. And so that I'm looking to extract what is the pearl of functionality, or that which is redeemable that's embedded in what you're saying. It's my job as a listener to extract that. And so that I don't start any of these interactions, any of these conversations, without first validating the other person. And validation is not agreement. Validation is not active listening. Is that with the student in that group, what I said to her was, I spoke about her courage, about her being honest with me about the ways in which she felt. And also, whatever it was that she was able to tap into that allowed her to stay in this meeting 2 to 3 hours, all those are attributes. And so I don't want to get blinded by or distracted by her affect without first appreciating that. And so the VCR is about, what is it that I want to uplift? And the other side of what I'm uplifting always has another side to it, which is the part that's not working well for the relationship. It's like sugar. It tastes good, but it's probably not good for the body. So then the C is to point out that part, the part that's not in service of the relationship. And then the R is to ask. So in this case, I would ask her, I want you to continue being honest with me and what you're thinking and to be present with me. And I think that your message would be even much more widely received if you could state that in a way that was less accusatory. I mean, just making this up in the moment. And so that's the idea to walk through the validation, challenge, or confront, and then a request. And that has a way of letting the air out of reactivity. It also has a way of allowing one to stay in a relationship longer.
And it allows someone to stay in relationship to their self, right? Like the idea of this validation of the other, and we were talking a few minutes about, it's not either you or me. So being able to validate her real reality of the pain she's experienced in being in this country in a low SES experience, you could stay connected to yourself in that. It wasn't if I think so often we have this feeling that we have to give ourselves up to do it. And then it didn't mean that you didn't still challenge and that you make a request. It's like it allows the process, even from our nerdy lens. We talk a lot about interpersonal neurobiology, and that is like from our lenses, we're able to challenge, we're able to name something and then make a request. There's a way to bring ourselves from that reactivity to that integration. So I like the way you put that. You still made a request. I could hear you better if it comes from a less accusatory place. How deeply you're holding yourself and how you deserve to be respected.
Right. Yeah, because the challenge is almost always, it's always planted in the soil of compassion accountability.
I just wanted to share with you, I think the two things I personally feel like you've brought to my experience and helped me challenge and look differently, both as a therapist and just as a white individual in the world, that's related to this is this idea of the difference between acknowledging one's intent, but covering yourself in your own defenses up through intent versus impact. Right. And so I feel like the VCR is really highlighting that, right? You are feeling pain, and so often we get stuck in the intent. And I think that's been I know it's been something that has helped me progress as an individual to say, but I didn't mean that. That's not what I meant. You misunderstood me. And to move away from that into the impact, no matter what my intent was. Right. And then I think the other thing is really helping me look at my own what white fragility really means. And I just wanted to bring those 2 points, the white fragility of me being so nervous to talk with you that I would get it wrong, that I would say something that would be offensive. And I think I've grown a lot to be more in relation because I'm not in my own preoccupation of how is my identity going to be received by you or by the world as a good white person, and allow myself to I'm going to jump on with Kenneth Hardy. I might make 20,000 mistakes that call my identity or my own racism out. And the fear, how that impacts if I live in my fear and I don't challenge it, then I don't get in relationship to you. I don't allow myself to make the mistakes. And there was something that you also said in there. It's like, I felt like you were also calling all of us in that dialogue and like helping people stay in relationship to my mistakes instead of going above me with my mistakes. Anyway, I just wanted to call those two things out as a therapist and as an individual, that those are two very impactful things that I feel like your labor and your work has helped me grow. And in that, I feel like I can stay more in relation. So it's not just I'm a better white person for somebody of color, right? Like, and how fragile that was. And how like, oh, if I can own my own pain of messing up and you don't have to I'm not asking you to take care of me and giving you room to call me out. And I feel like, well, I guess you were calling her in. I want to be careful. It was a call in, right? You called her in, right? And if I can hold my own pain and biases and be called out by you, by call in by you, by saying, I hear you in this way, but this is how it impacts me, then I'm not asking you to take care of me. I'm asking you to stay in relationship to me.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's the key, and that's the world I dream of being a part of when we can do that. And like I said, that particular student, I mean, there was a world I could draw from that really allowed me to relate to what she was saying. And that when you're experiencing that kind of degradation and trauma, it's easy to conflate a number of things and to not be able to see through this critical lens that I was inviting her to see. And if you've never thought about yourself as being white, which is true for most white people. So I thought it was important. And I just think that staying in those kinds of conversations, I think, allow us to move the needle a little bit, because the alternative is that we continue to do what we have done historically, which is what you just not engage for fear of saying the wrong thing, or engage, quickly escalate, and separate. And those options don't serve us very well.
No, it doesn't keep us in relation, does it? It doesn't keep us, which is the passion that you really bring. And I think on some level, we share the passion of helping these conversations expand, spread, become deeper, our ability to tolerate discomfort so that we can stay in engagement and grow and move the needle, be part of moving the needle that your grandmother was part of and your mother was part of giving to you, and you're bringing it to continue to move these really difficult conversations to another level.
Absolutely.
Having said that, before we end, I really would love to know your thoughts. We've got recent executive orders eliminating DEI programs, looking at any mention of race, et cetera, to be identified and targeted. I really want to know your experience of that, and then maybe any input you might have to helping therapists even navigate these conversations with people that are directly impacted by these policies.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, you please let me know if this makes any sense to you. So one is that I just think for those of us for whom this work is important, and I remember I gave a speech once, and the whole speech was drawing a distinction between our jobs and our work. And so for me, the work of DEI is a part of my work. It's not connected to brick and mortar. It's not connected to a salary or benefits. It's that which we take on to help do our small part to leave the world a slightly better place than it was when we inherited it. So I think that DEI, for me and for many others, is a part of my work, not my job. And when it's a part of our work, then I think we have to hold on to the notion that DEI will never DIE, because it's a part of our work. It's a calling. And I think in the midst of all the chaos and the turbulence, I actually, and this is going to sound really demented to you, and I'm being totally honest with you, I actually feel a sense of hope from all of this, because I don't think that the current wave is sustainable. That I think that we lean toward fairness and justice, and I don't think that this could have a long life. But here's the thing that leaves me feeling most hopeful, and it may probably be the most confusing to you. But when I saw the letter that the Trump administration wrote to Harvard, and in that letter they were asking them to get rid of staff and faculty, and to demonstrate they were bringing people on who had, I think they were calling it perspective and ideological diversity. There was something deeply paradoxical about that left me feeling hopeful, because you are now advocating for the very thing that you're repudiating. Like, they use those words, diversity. And so, as I said in the workshop, I don't run away from being characterized as woke. And yet, when I think about all of these executive orders from the administration, when I look beneath the inhumaneness of it and the callousness of it, and maybe I'm making this up, I don't know, but what seems to be driving it is this sense, this desire to belong and to be included. So you have white men who feel like, one told me in a workshop, this is not a good time to be white. I feel excluded. And so in some ways, you're searching for the same thing I'm searching for. And so there's something wildly paradoxical about that. But also, it's hope inducing, because what it says is that even though I don't agree with any piece of that and the way you're going about doing it, at the very beneath of it is what you're trying to put in places where people who don't feel like they belong can feel belong, like they're included. Well, that's the exact same thing I've been working for my entire career. And yet our methodologies. So what I believe is there's an underlying value that's integral to our core as human beings. And so if that's the case, then it leaves me hopeful that this can never be obliterated. Does that make sense to you?
It makes a lot of sense. Yes, and especially landing on a hopefulness. And I think of the conversation about the subjugated parts. If I'm a white man and I don't have a lot of subjugated parts, right? I still have them, depending, like everyone does. But I think what you're saying is that there are many people out there who haven't been in touch with that part, getting in touch with that part, and what it feels like to experience the exclusion, to the bias, and how hard it is to be a white man. And the hopefulness is that that part can be integrated into a deeper sense of, oh, that's what you've been talking about. Am I catching you?
That's exactly right. And so that's what leads me. So it's like these folks saying, I need to know that Harvard and Columbia and Berkeley are changing so that my conservative white male son can get into those universities and do well.
At an equal rate of everybody else.
Right. And so in some ways, you are the embodiment of everything that you label and accuse me of being. So that leaves me feeling hopeful about the value of belonging, the value of because when you have the audacity to put in this letter to Harvard, which I could not believe, diversity of perspective, while you're saying to the rest of the world, scrub your websites and remove the word diversity, the very word you're going to use, you're forbidding nonprofits from using.
Oh my gosh, a huge light bulb just went off. The very word that if a university uses now, they could lose funding.
Or any nonprofit organization. And if you pull that letter up, it's not in there once, it's in there several times. The very word you forbid Ken Hardy, the woke person, from using. I find it not just fascinating, paradoxical, but also hopeful.
Wow. Thank you for that. That leaves me with a little bit of hope that what they're striving for. And I agree. I think there is so much out there that we want something very different than what is happening. So your belief is very hopeful to me. It feels like to me that we're also highlighting, I know my belief about the level of racism in this country was so ignorant prior to this experience. And that one of the things that's changed for me is I'm like, oh my God, how could I have been so ignorant? I mean, like, how could I be so blind? And it's helped, like, to feel like, oh my God, we need to fight together on a whole different realm rather than, oh no, that's the part of the past. To see it live and exist and be voted. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and it's not just about your individual ignorance. It's about a whole way the system is organized, because it's, that those of us who are harmed by it in some ways are equally as ignorant. I mean, but we don't name it. It's so incredibly subtle. And that's why I think that conversations like the one we're having today is so important. I think it's important to name these things and write about it, which is why I try to do that.
People need to hear it and want to hear it. Actually, they want to grow. People want to make sense of what's going on, because I think the biggest feeling I get from most people, like, this makes no sense. It's just crazy. And the more we believe that, rather than getting in touch with, no, there's something happening that is real. And I think, and that's why the last part of that question is, how do you help therapists navigate that conversation when people are directly impacted and seeing nothing but hopelessness like this? Like it's just going to continue. These people of power are going to continue to be able to dominate. It's hopeless.
And I think that hopelessness is contagious, and hope is as well. And that we've had these struggles before, and whether it's around women's suffrage, or whether it's slavery, or Japanese in camps, or gay marriage. I mean, and that we have to stay focused and adopt this notion that DEI as an acronym is so important to us that we refuse to let it DIE. And I think that's where I am.
I want to really express again my gratitude for you taking the time in your busy schedule to come and have this conversation with me and and for our listeners.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this. I think it's important. I think if there's ever a time where there's a need for podcasts like the one you're doing, that time is right now. So best wishes.
Thank you. Thanks so much, you guys, for joining us. This conversation was extremely meaningful, and I hope it was to you. Please pass it on, share it. We want these kind of conversations to spread ripples of security and connection. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you around the bend.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelley and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.